Let me start out by introducing myself. I'm Linda Thomas Greenfield. I am a, can't call myself distinguished, you guys have to do that, but
I will call it distinguished.
the first distinguished, I don't even know what the title is, I had diplomat in the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy for African Studies. I started here last March, coming after 35 years in the State Department. And I'm really delighted to be here with you, but I'm particularly delighted to welcome Ambassador Sanders to this Distinguished Practitioners Series. This is my third event with her to discuss this book, and when I heard her, I thought she would be perfect. This would be a perfect venue for her to present the findings of her book, The Rise of Africa's Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. I want to start out by thanking the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy for co-hosting this event today, as well as the Department of African Studies, who also is a co-host for us. Ambassador Sanders has had a very distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service. She was our ambassador to Nigeria, one of the toughest, if not the toughest, and most complicated assignments that we have in the Foreign Service. Tough not because of Nigeria or Nigerians, but tough because it's a big country that has complex issues. And it's a big embassy that requires keen management skills. And she showed us how well prepared she was for that assignment, and did an extraordinary job for the department. She was also our ambassador to the Republic of Congo, and I could go on. It would take the whole evening for me to go through her bio, but you can read her bio in the announcements that came out, and if you buy the book, you can read her bio in the book. So let me turn the floor over to the person you've come to hear. She will speak, and then I will coordinate and try to manage the Q&A session that hopefully will be very engaging. So thank you, Ambassador Sanders.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, and thank all of you for being here, and I really appreciate being invited as your first speaker, I guess, in the series for 2018, which is also an honor. I want to start by really saying I wrote the book for your generation, to be clear. And if you think about the title, The Rise of Africa's Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, that's the term that's used for Africa's small businesses. I know we tend to use the term small business here in the U.S., but mostly in the developing countries, particularly in the 54 countries on that continent, they tend to use the term small and medium-sized enterprises. But for those of you who don't know, I just wanted to provide that definition. That means small businesses. And it really is about thinking about entrepreneurship differently. What I have found throughout maybe the last decade and a half of my career working in really some very, very dire countries that had challenges on social and economic development. I mean, you've heard a few of the countries that I served in as ambassadors, but I also had very challenging countries throughout my career. Sudan, I started early off with my first tour actually being in, that first African tour actually being in Sudan. And so during the course of that, I wasn't thinking, of course, about writing a book at that time, but one of the things I did observe as a diplomat and as a practitioner was the challenges with development, no matter how much development money was going into the continent. When we woke up in 2000, we still looked at a partner, meaning the entire country, continent of Africa, that still had extreme poverty, where 90% plus of the population still lived below the poverty level, or below $1 a day. When I did the research, I wanted to know, well, how much money had actually been spent between when most countries got their independence in 1960 and 2000, where I think the shift change began to take place. And I'll tell you about that shift change a little bit later. But when I looked at the amount of money, it was $2.4 trillion had been spent just on development. And when I'm talking about development sectors, I'm talking about, food security and gender equality and education and health systems and all of the things you think about when you're involved in the development sector. That's a lot of money. But when you think about the year 2000, and I see that as really a shift change, not just with the U.S. relationship with the continent, thinking about it differently. Because before we had a little bit of benign neglect during the Cold War, and then after the Cold War we had another form of benign neglect to some extent, where we weren't looking at Africa as a partner or as a strategic partner. But if you remember what on the global stage in 2000, what else happened? Well, 2000 was the beginning of the Millennium Development Goals. So the world woke up a little bit, including the continent, saying, what we're doing is not working. We're not really fundamentally changing the day-to-day poverty lives of the average African citizen. African governments aren't, and we as the development community aren't. And you can go back, the book is really a research book. I've footnoted everything. I've given you every reference, so you can go back and look at some of these figures if you want to. But the OECD, the Organization of Economic Development, Cooperation and Development, did this report about how much money had been spent. And so I was thinking along the lines of, what's the story here? What's the story for young millennials to think about, entrepreneurs or those in the development sector? But more importantly, I wanted to tell a good news story about Africa as well. Because what I saw, and I'm sure that the ambassador did as well, probably in the mid-2000s, for me it started about 2004, 2003, 2004, and a little bit later as well in other countries. But I really saw this energy coming from, at that time, the Generation Xers, would have been in the mid-2000s, really trying to find their own way to step into the development gaps that they did not feel were being addressed by the development community. And if they were being addressed, they weren't being addressed in the large enough numbers for the size and the population of the continent. Today, Africa's population is about 1.5 billion. It's on course by 2050 to be 2.4 billion. So when you think about all those dynamics, I consider demographics strategic issues. Because if you're not paying attention to demographics, even here in the United States, then you're missing something. So that's the message too that I want to share with you. But what I saw with that Generation Xers, and then going forward, the millennials, really trying to find their own way, find their own job creation to make. And what I liked about what I saw was that even though they were focused on their own job creation, taking ownership for themselves of their future and their ability to help themselves and also have an ability to reach back and help others, is what I call in the book kind of business aiding development. Most of the SMEs that at least I'm involved with, and I know the ambassador as well, they want to also find a way to give back. It's not just about making sure I can take care of myself and my family and maybe hire 2 or 3 other people, but also what is the social enterprise component of what I'm doing that I can give back. And to me, that's a very good news, very good story to tell about the continent. I've done a lot of engagement with business schools around the United States, asking me about the importance of business models, the importance of entrepreneurship. And what I say to them, using the Africa example, is that yes, I think the traditional business methods are extremely important. But what I found in the African context for SMEs is that sometimes it's just about getting started. It's not necessarily about having a 5-year plan. It's not necessarily about trying to think 6 or 7 years out, but it's just getting started. And the other thing I found in stepping into that development void that I talked about was keeping it simple. And there's so many examples about that around the world, even here in the U.S. When you think about Uber's had a rocket science, invention. It's a simple response to a need. And if I say anything, that I think that is the message for those of you in the audience who want to be entrepreneurs for the future. The social enterprise component of giving back, I think, is extremely important. But certainly, if you are trying to develop something on your own, then think about what's the need I'm trying to fill. what's the gap I'm trying to fill. And for what I saw in the SMEs that I've worked with in the past, throughout Sudan and Senegal and all the places that I've served, particularly in the latter years of my career, was this ability to say, there's this gap here. What can I do to fill it? Whether it's a service or a good. And there's so many wonderful examples, and I've given a few in the book, about where African SMEs have kind of stepped into this void. And what I have found, though, is you have, this dichotomy of conversation. When you think about American business framework, I think most of you might think that most of the businesses in the United States are large businesses that maybe have 900 plus employees, but that's not the case. Most of the American businesses come from small businesses. Small business makes up more than probably about 65% right now of our business sector. And they contribute about 54% today to our GDP. And what African small businesses are trying to do is pretty much the same thing. So you have these great examples. You have, Africa cloud-based streaming developing, since they can't have access to, using Amazon necessarily, because sometimes their local credit card doesn't get accepted by Amazon. PayPal doesn't work, on the continent. So they've developed their own Africa streaming services, their own Uber-like services for taxis in places like Abidjan in West Africa. And Nigeria is even more unique because the traffic in Nigeria is so bad, even if you were in an Uber, it wouldn't help you. And so what they've developed there, and SME has developed there, is something called GoMax. And I actually met the CEO of GoMax last month when I was in Nigeria. And it's using it's an Uber-like service for scooters. So you call a GoMax scooter and you get your little helmet and you get your face mask because it's the traffic and the dust and the fumes. You don't want that, and so it fills a need. Is what I'm talking about, and it is quite simple. I tell this story a lot, so unfortunately the ambassadors kind of heard it a couple of times, but I will share it because I do get asked a lot. Where did my passion for this issue come from, and how did I even start thinking about African? They weren't even called SMEs at that time. That's a fairly new term within the last 8 years or so. But we used to do, as in the development community, income generating projects. Where you would get a small stipend and then you'd have to go back and get another stipend. So what was missing from all of that was what? Sustainability for the entity. And that whole term sustainability, I want you to kind of keep that in your head as we talk today. But I had just arrived in Congo Brazzaville after it had 7 years of civil war. The country was completely destroyed. We didn't have even a functioning embassy building at that time to operate out of. But I remember one night I had been there maybe about 3 weeks, almost hardly any electricity except for on these 4 cross streets that went across the town. And I was coming back home one evening and I kept seeing these young people laying in the middle of the street where it was dangerous. It was still a very conflict-ridden environment. We had ups and downs on security and fighting in the street and shooting, and we'd have to have the embassy on lockdown and so forth. And I thought it was so dangerous for these young people to be laying in the street. And they were laying under these broken street lights. There were very few. And I couldn't tell from my car what they were doing. And finally one day I just said, I really need to get out of the car and ask them, why are you risking, you're in this very, very insecure environment. Why are you laying in the middle of the street? And so I did. And what they told me was that they wanted to make their own money. And this is in French. And so it didn't quite get it, I'll be honest with you. Make your own money, how's that different from a job? How's that different from X, Y, and Z? But it is quite different when you think about it. Because when you look at that term income generating project, and not being sustainable, and when you look at the ability to create enough jobs for the population figures that I just gave you, that's virtually impossible to do. But when you're making your own money, you are controlling your own life. And And at that time, that was a generation of young people that had known nothing but Civil War, for the most part. So I began to understand that and work with the UN colleague, and just to make a long story short, we worked together to put the first cyber center back in Congo. Because that same generation, guess what they weren't exposed to at that time? We're talking about 2004, 2005. Remember, they had been 7 years computer. Most of them had never even seen a computer, let alone use one, because it wasn't in electricity. They were in for survival more than anything else, and it was a physically destroyed country for the most part. So, all those things came together for that Generation Xers. When you think about when Twitter began and LinkedIn and all the social media, you're still talking about that same period of time, 2005, 2006. And it really is that convergence of wanting to make my own money, or if you flip income generation around to generating income, that's really what they meant. So if you take on generating your own income, you add to it the advent of social media, and you add to it not only access to computers, which they didn't have, but the other sister part to that. There are two sister parts to the IT story. It's not only the internet and the computers, but it is mobility and it's knowledge management. Because in your hand, for the first time, when you think about that period of time, you've got that mobility. So I'm sitting in Tanzania, I can communicate with somebody that's in Nigeria. I can say, I have a product to sell you. You think about that, so it provides you knowledge in your own hand. So what you see today with the, there wasn't a clear figure on that, and I talk about these challenges I found in talking about SMBs, but you have this huge growth of Generation Xers, and today some of them are actually billionaires. In fact, the gentleman that did the forward on my book is the richest African in the world today, and he started out as a Generation Xer with a very limited amount of resources. But if you fast forward to today, you'll see that there, the top out of the top 10 people listed in Forbes today, 5 of them are African leaders and 3 of them are Nigerian. When you look at the fastest growing economies in the world today, you've got 7 out of the 10 still today, even though we're in a different semi-recession period for a lot of countries, still they have a greater GDP than we do, and they have a greater growth than we do here in the United States still today. So that's the good news story. So you think about it, when you wrap it up, you've got this dynamic generation of Xers, followed by millennials doing the same thing, creating these incredible apps. The first drone was built on the continent last year by a young Kenyan. You have these incredible inventions, the first digital laser by a young South African physicist last year. You've got all of these wonderful examples of stepping into the voids, whether you're talking about food security. One of my favorite apps is a Kenyan app called iCow, and it helps small farm holders. It almost functions like a mercantile exchange for them to know about their cows and gestation periods and the cost of dairy milk and all of those kinds of things. You've got the cashless society that's the creativity on cashless society really rests in Africa, where you've got things like M-Pesa, which is a cashless app. It really has started at the forefront there. You've got these kiosk banks that prop up where you can just do everything. So they're way ahead of us on financial literacy and mobility. So let's talk quickly about the challenges.
They give us an hour and a half, which probably needs more time than
Okay.
we need.
Okay.
So let's give everybody a chance to answer.
Sure. So that's the IT good news story, and that's where all of the things have kind of stepped in. One of my other great favorite things is looking at what women are doing. Certainly the gap for women is enormous. The inequality is enormous. I don't know if any of you are following the World Economic Forum discussions like I am today, but one of the striking things, the two striking things that I tweeted about recently was the fact that only 1 in 5 people that get invited to WEF, is a woman. And in these days and time, that just doesn't make any sense. And the other thing is because of the kind of a little bit of the backlash they've gotten a little bit on that, they've scrambled now and added more women as moderators and commentators and all that. But still, clearly, it's not being thought of as part of the strategic plan when you do things. And so, just keep that in mind. The other thing for small business and women is this ability to step into niche areas. So remember I said, keep it simple, think about a service need, but there's a subcategory of that too. What are some of the niche areas? And I think niche areas are really, really important for women businesses, particularly in places like the continent. One of my favorite examples is a business called Sweet Dreams, actually. You can actually Google it. There's a wonderful, wonderful video clip of this story. But it really is we're an SME in the U.S. and an SME partner in Rwanda, in a small town called Mortara, Rwanda, decided that they were going to make homemade ice cream. Nobody in Mortara had homemade ice cream. It's not a new idea. Ice cream is not a new food, all right? But in Mortara, Rwanda, it was a new food. And the practice of eating ice cream, we walk down the street licking an ice cream cone and think nothing of it. Culturally, in Mortara, Rwanda, that's not a thing to do. So you have, all of these things to overcome, and they've done a tremendous job. And now it is this kind of wonderful story to tell all the time about how women can step into this niche area, particularly on the continent, to really create a business, in an environment where they're the only one doing that particular business. You have examples in South Africa where it's women that are starting the vegetarian restaurants. So, the niche area for women, I think, on the continent is really, really important. And the other aspect of that, when we talk about sort of the role that IT plays, is that I could not find one African IT company that had a female as its CEO. And so that tells you also where the emphasis needs to be. And one of the things in terms of talking about education is bringing that dynamic of teaching information science and technology to young women, particularly if you're talking about doing things in niche areas and service areas. And so I was really, really sad to see that there was not any IT company on the continent led by women. And when I looked worldwide, we really only have about 10 total. So I don't know if you saw or heard about the movie Hidden Figures, that whole idea of women in technology. I think that's the gap. That's a gap that any development partner definitely needs to focus on, and any national government definitely needs to focus on, to make sure that the next generation of women on the continent are IT savvy. Even if you don't want to run your own business in the IT sector, you still have to be IT savvy really to do any business today, quite frankly. So fundamentally, that's one of the challenges that I saw for women entrepreneurs. They are growing, but they have the biggest challenge. There's a $285 billion financing gap just for women worldwide, for women businesses worldwide. That's an enormous gap. 285 billion. I didn't say million, I said billion. And that's the financing gap for women worldwide that are operating in small business. So if you're thinking about being in either the policy sector or on the development sector, you've got to focus on that, because women make up 50.2%. They just edged out men last year. 50.2% of the population of the continent. And when you think about the fact that they will be half the continent, plus you will have the other half, or a mixture of the half, also being people under the age of 40. There's a startling IMF figure that I also like to share that came out when I was doing this research, is that when you look at the working population of China, and you combine them with the US, and you combine that with Europe, and you combine that with Asia, in 2035, the working population of Africa will be greater than those combined, not individual but combined. So if you take all of those together, the working population of the continent will be greater than that. And so what I like to say when I engage people today in the administration that talk about just doing business and trade, I did an interview this morning with Voice of America, actually, where my counterpart person on the panel was just talking about business and trade and saying that's all we want to do with Africa is business and trade. We don't want to talk about democracy. We don't want to talk about government. I said, well, that just doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you don't have the enabling environment that is transparent, that is democratic, then who are you going to trade with? Particularly if they're going to have the largest working population in the world. So even if you eliminate the trade portion of it, and you only talk about, developing jobs in the U.S., the same answer applies in my view. Because who's going to buy your goods and services when we saturate our market domestically? If you're going to use financing mechanisms like the U.S. Exim, who are you going to do that with if you're not going to engage a continent like Africa? And this all kind of stemmed from the comments that were reportedly coming out of the White House about 10 days ago about Africa not being important enough to engage with. So I want to share that with you, because I think that when you think about Africa, it is a vibrant, dynamic, complex, and a continent full of variety. It's not a one-stop shopping. Each country is unique. The people are dynamic. It is a continent on the move. You have, even though we have a little bit of regression, I would say, and I don't know whether Master would agree with me on the democracy front. The last 18 months have not been great on the democracy front. So we've had a little bit of regression, I think, that worries all of us who work on Africa. But that being said, you still have a populace, anyway, that believes in the democratic process, even if they get stopped sometimes by their electoral commission or, unfortunately, their current leader or future leaders. But this sentiment of democracy and this sentiment of fairness and justice is very much entrenched on the continent, I would say. And so when you're thinking about all of that domestically for the U.S., it makes sense for us to be engaged with such a vibrant and dynamic continent, and to take our lenses off and be as colorblind as possible when we're thinking about U.S. policy. The other elements that I wanted to talk about was, the sectors that I see Africa SMEs really striving in, connected with that business aid and development. Certainly, small manufacturing, food security. What I didn't put agriculture as a sector by itself, because there's so many elements of agriculture. You could be in food processing, you could be a small farm holder, you could be in packaging. So I put a lot of those things in what I call the service element. I have 8 sectors. I call them the TEL list, or the top 8 list, of where I see SMEs doing well, but also, and those same sectors are where they can grow more. And when you think about yourself, if you're looking for your own entrepreneurial way forward, think about what those sectors might be for you here in the U.S. or with a partner that you might want to engage with, be it in Africa or China or elsewhere. The other one is the climate change sector. And I say that particularly because Africa is one of 2 continents most affected by climate change. It's most affected by climate change. But on the positive side, it has still, along with Latin America, the greatest number of waterways and arable land, despite the climate change issue thus far. I spent 3 weeks in South Africa in December, and it was really the first time, I must admit, that I was really backed up against climate change and really in-your-face climate change. Extreme drought. Your water is measured every day. You cannot use more than 87 liters. 87 liters a day. You have to take a half-minute shower, if at all. You know, I went to a reserve area and the animals are just suffering. The big game animals are just suffering. There's just not enough water for them to drink, or I mean, and the desertification is just even though it's not on the desert, I still use that term because just you see all of the arable land just drying up right before your eyes. And so I put climate change and tourism in there because they have to figure out how to manage that, and a lot of SMEs can play a role in that. Whether you are helping a small hotel services managing their water, becoming green, you know, there are all kinds of things that you can do. In fact, the UN World Tourism Organization said 1 out of 4 jobs over the next decade should be in the climate change field. So think about that for yourselves as well. And certainly the IT sector, whether you are providing some kind of IT service, and I've already given that, where everything is accurate, and whether you're doing the Go Max or something else, you have an opportunity, in that sector. It's been interesting to see the new players that have come into the Africa SME sector in terms of trying to find ways to help finance, and you've got foundations, but the private sector has stepped up in a way that they hadn't, I would say, before 2005 or something. That whole corporate social responsibility efforts that a lot of corporations, be they American or others that are doing on the continent, I think it's a good thing. And they tend to be focused on sustainability, and they look at SMEs as the sustainable way to do things. And when you think about that, remember that shift change I talked about. You had the MDGs in 2000. Then what did you have in 2015, and how did that MDG name get changed? It got changed to SDGs because everybody recognized that you've got to have the sustainability component to things. So, the SDGs I think are quite good, but when I really examined them, they talk about entrepreneurship, and they talk about job creation, and they talk about employment, but nowhere do they line item list the role of small businesses, which I think is an error. And when you look at the African Union document, which is called Agenda 2063, they do the same thing. They talk about employment, particularly employment for women and job creation, but nowhere do they line item their role and importance of SMEs. So one of the recommendations I make is, I don't care what it's called, but in the book I call it the Africa Strategic Plan for SMEs. Because if you have a unified document, then you have more likelihood for resources to be marshaled in that direction, and a focus, and everybody to be talking the same thing. Because one of the other challenges that came out in the research is this definition of what is an SME. It is literally all over the map for the continent. Some defined by employee size, some defined by capitalization, some defined by valuation. So when you are a donor, or even a private sector or venture capitalist, you can make up your own definition of what an SME is. And so if we had a unified document that, like, everybody was marshalling behind the SDGs and the MDGs, we need something very similar that can be subsumed under either one of those documents for SMEs in the future. Because there's no way that you can create enough formal sector jobs for that size of a population. There's just no way you can do it. It has to come from that. And if we haven't learned anything, it's a shame, because we can learn from our own history. That's what we had to do. And when you think about it, our Small Business Administration, this may still sound like a long time ago. It was only created in 1953. But look how long before that we were an industrialized country. It took us a while to get it together to understand how important SME growth is, or whatever term you want to use, small business growth is. And right now, it contributes, we're in a little bit, our GDP is not that high, but still, SMEs contribute 54% to our GDP. And it needs to continue to do the same thing on the continent. When you look at examples like China, you look at examples like India, it's evident that is how they were able to turn their economies around, despite whatever political view you have about either. They are doing a great job in that area, and Africa is really trying to follow that example. The other player that doesn't get mentioned a lot, and I do want to talk about that, is African stock markets. You have about 5, mostly small, but the 3 bigger ones do have an exchange for SMEs. So there's a way for SMEs to raise capital. You've got the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is the largest, and then you have the Nigerian Stock Exchange, and then you have the Kenyan Stock Exchange. And they all have an exchange just for SMEs, so they have another way to raise capital. And I think that that's an important thing to do. On the challenges that remain, clearly more needs to be done on the democracy and governance front. There is absolutely no linkage, in my view, between those two things. But what you do see is this rise of small businesses, some of them also taking on those issues. Because once you have political economic power, we see that here, then you can translate that into political power. And you do see that a little bit more and more in the continent, particularly in places like South Africa, where you have these young entrepreneurs really out there talking about the things that they want to see in the political arena, the transparency they want to see from their legislatures and from their presidency. And when you think about that here in the U.S., if you're making an equal exchange in terms of that impact, we have that voice too, as middle income earners, as small businesses. That brings with it some political voice, and you see that same kind of dynamic, happening on the continent. So I think I'll stop there, and I can elaborate, with the Q&A part once we go.
Well, thank you very much. That was extraordinarily. Take the priority of the chair and ask the first question, and then I'll open it up for the rest of you. One of the things that you talked about was the vote, and some of the numbers that we have seen across the continent of Africa are almost frightening. The median age across the continent is 19. I think I actually saw that it, in fact, dropped to 18, which means half the population 18 and under the age of 18. So what this means for the future is a huge, huge need for job creation and education programs. How do you see the SMEs contributing to that extraordinary requirement?
That's a great question. I have an education chapter in the book, and it talks about new educational approaches. Because I do believe I'm not excluding traditional education at all, whether it's, K through 12 or above. But what I have seen, again, as a shift change was an entrepreneurial approach to education. I had the opportunity to visit the site of one of the entities that I highlight in this book called the African Leadership Academy. And I had met the creator of the African Leadership Academy, who is in that age range that she's talking about. Fred, I think when Fred created the ALA, he's 28 now, so maybe he was in his early 20s. And he had this vision to do pre-university training, a Pan-African approach to pre-university training. And so he was able to get this incredible institution off the ground. They will be celebrating their 10th year next year. And what they've done, and is now trying to be replicated elsewhere, is they have 2 parts of it. They take from 13 years old to 18 pre-university. And they provide an entrepreneurial way of thinking, think entrepreneurial, which is very different from traditional thinking. You might want to be an entrepreneur, but can you also think entrepreneurially about how you go about getting there? The other part to what I think is fabulous is that, if you don't know somebody, if you don't know your neighbor, you can have these preconceived notions about your neighbor that aren't true. And what he found, I think, traveling around the continent is that Ghanaians didn't know Ugandans, didn't know Ethiopians, didn't know what have you. So he wanted to open this up to the entire continent. So the students I had an opportunity, they were from the entire continent. So not only do you break down these barriers or these preconceived notions about a particular country or particular ethnic group even, but you end up with this whole network of people that you grow up with. You know, because you be in a 13 to 15 2-year program, and then you can also then stay on and be in the latter 2-year program. So you are not only a global and Pan-African thinker, but you're entrepreneurial. You have these other cohorts that you engage with, and you're able to come out and really be a global citizen in a way that most of us don't get the opportunity to do. The other one is edutech. You know, looking at using online a lot more than traditional class, because, you know, if I use Nigeria as an example, they have about, at the tertiary level, at the university level, you have maybe 4 to 5 million students that can't get a seat. They don't have enough seats. So what do those students do? So this SME called EduTech has stepped into this to provide online curriculum. It's taken a while. They've had to work with these universities to get their curriculum in an online component format. And everything is done. Your payments are done. You don't have to take out the corruption aspect where you have to, pay somebody to. So there are answers to that. Where we have the challenge, though, is at the secondary level and primary education, particularly for girls. Because you have this entrepreneurial stuff going on at the university and maybe the pre-university. For the bulk of the primary students coming up, we don't do enough, I don't think, in terms of money, and neither does many other countries. And we also don't do vocational training at all, which I think is also very, very important to do. So even though I see some bright rays of hope, they tend to be on the higher education side. But they're not at the secondary, and they're not at the primary education level, and that's a challenge.
Thank you. Yes, and tell us who you are.
Good evening, I'm Maud Cooper. I'm in the
What's your first name?
Maud.
Maud, okay.
I'm in the International Development Policy Program through the McCourt School, and I echo a lot of what you've said and what you're feeling. And I had a question though that goes to the infrastructure piece. Mm-hmm. So I actually am Liberian, and my parents have a small business actually on the continent. And while it is true, like that's where employment is going, and that is what's going to be necessary, I think, even for Liberia and for a lot of developing countries on the continent to really address, especially with the young population. Liberia is right at that 18, half the population is under 18 in Liberia, which is definitely a concern.
It may even be worse there.
It's a little bit worse.
Yeah.
There's a repeat. The problem is that under 18 having multiple children, which is why our demographic is extremely young. But the infrastructure piece actually tends to be a really big issue. There's a big financing gap for infrastructure on the African continent. I've heard several different figures, but it tends to be close to around $1 billion to get the infrastructure where it would need to be to really get interconnected. Because that's another issue in and of itself, is that individually countries don't have very strong infrastructure, whether you're talking road networks, electricity, really, really fundamental to make small and medium enterprises actually affordable. Because, I mean, when you're having to use generator power all the time, it's very burdensome for a small business to absorb that cost and that maintenance. So I think there isn't necessarily an outpouring of money for infrastructure projects on the African continent. So what would your thoughts be on that? How do we start addressing that? Because small and medium enterprises cannot address that infrastructure gap. It's just too expensive for them to absorb and find the money on their own. Whereas there is some small things where people will contribute to a small road, per se, that they're all using. But large scale, to get countries interconnected and really get inter-African trade, you would need large scale infrastructure projects to facilitate that. So what are your thoughts on addressing that issue? Because that is a major issue it doesn't matter what country you go to on the continent, really, the infrastructure question.
You know, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield was in Liberia's ambassador.
Yes, for sure. Okay. Very familiar.
So I will also turn to her to say some more on the Liberia part to your question, if she wishes. The infrastructure gap financing is $5 billion according to the African Development.
Thank you.
That's huge.
Excuse me?
Is it billion or trillion?
I thought he
You know,
said billion.
it's
I don't
billion.
like the-
It's a
it's
feature.
just-
It
just
was
said
in on Twitter
On
this
Twitter,
morning.
yeah.
I think it was 5 billion.
Yeah, billion.
Okay.
Mhm. Go back and check, but I thought I heard 5 billion.
That's it, that's cool.
And so, let me separate your question into two parts, because also on my tell list is infrastructure. I didn't want to give you a whole list of 8, but on that top 8 list, infrastructure is on there. And what I recommend for SMEs is don't try to take that on. That's not your space. But find your large company partner and be a subcontractor on an infrastructure project. That's not easy to do because there's not a lot of confidence by a lot of big businesses in small and medium-sized enterprises, but you do have some rays of hope out there. You have, about 5 or 6 countries that have started these special enterprise zones or special economic zones, where they make space for SMEs to partner with big businesses, so that you build that confidence. You build that confidence in that relationship, because you also, as the SME, you learn from the big business, and the big business then looks to you also as somebody they have confidence in to bring in on a project. It is not replicated very much on the continent, but I think it is a way to begin to address that issue. So those countries that have started that special economic zone, like Ghana and Nigeria and Zambia, those zones are all being built by the Chinese, though, I must say, to be honest. But I don't care who's building them. I mean, if they are doing the right thing, then that's fine. So there's that. That's a possible way forward. That's a possible way forward, but it's not the answer for SMEs in terms of infrastructure. What I think the SMEs that I think are successful here go back to that keeping it simple model, and looking at the ability of IT and the mobility and the knowledge management. Find a way to use those tools initially. If you're in one of those countries that have a special economic zone where you can become part of that, so you can partner with a large company that's in that special economic zone, so you can be the subcontractor. For instance, I have an SME that I work with. I'm actually on their board. They actually created the EduTech model, and then they replicated that EduTech model to in a way, transportation, if you want to. It's not quite transportation, but in Nigeria, there were no toll roads, all right? And so they started creating toll roads, and what BGG did was take that cashless model they had on EduTech and made a similar thing like our Easy Pass here in the United States. So they control the I'll use the term Easy Pass, but they control the toll paying, the electronic toll paying. You're helping on infrastructure in a way, because you're supporting that infrastructure contract to build a road, but then you provide the IT toll service, where you get the little thing like you have on your Easy Pass, and you drive right through to the airport, and you get, your money gets taken like it does on E. So you're playing a role in a broader infrastructure project, but you're not out there as an SME trying to build a road. So there are ways to get involved in infrastructure. It goes back to that simplicity. What's the service? Where is the gap? What can I do with the resources that I have to fill that gap and to fill that service? And, having cut my teeth on this issue in a totally devastating country mod, like at the time, like Congo Brazzaville, I know that anything is possible. I understand that anything is possible if you keep it simple. Keep it simple. Doesn't mean you can't move into something later, but keep it simple. What can I do with what I have? And the other thing is I also work with a solar energy company, SME, and it goes back to that power issue that you talked about. And what we provide is, both SME and family level solar panels. That's all. So if you just want a solar panel for your house, we can give you that, and it will do, say, 5 light bulbs and a fan. If you can't do 5 light bulbs, you can't afford that, it does 2 light bulbs, or 5 light bulbs in a refrigerator, what have you. And so I had an opportunity to go visit a couple of sites when I was there in November, and this entrepreneur that had a little store talked about how he was able to really double his business just by the virtues he's able to stay open until 10 p.m. at night. So just think about those kinds of things. You know, you can play a role in infrastructure. You don't have to build a road.
Just quickly on infrastructure, particularly regionally, one of the things that we've been looking at, and I just saw, I think yesterday, that MCC, which is the only arm of funding that we have for infrastructure in Africa, is looking at doing regional projects. So working with more than one country to provide a road network or a train system or ports that support more than one country, and I think that's going to make a major contribution.
The other thing on that, Maud, is if you take a look at regional trade or intra-trade, it hasn't changed in Africa in 2 decades. It's still about 11%.
Yeah.
It hasn't moved in 2 decades. And that it hasn't moved because you don't have the cross-border infrastructure. You see that changing a bit. You know, I'm glad that MCC is doing that, but China has really stepped up to the plate. They've done the last 3 railroads, you know, connecting major cities to the port, or connecting 2 countries like Ethiopia and Djibouti to the port. So you do see that happening. Unfortunately, we're playing a lesser role in those kinds of things than I would like to see us play, unfortunately. Because in the end, what does that mean for us 10 years from now? We're out of that game completely. That means we're not going, you know, that's why the whole idea of just focusing on business and trade I just don't understand that, because the things are not disassociated. You know, if you're not there, then you're not going to be the first person they want to trade with. China and Africa have the largest trade relationship. They have the largest trade relationship, and that's just going to increasingly get bigger. The way things are going right now, they're doing all the big infrastructure projects. They're both the president, prime minister, and foreign minister have both been there. Have all 3 been there this year, and they make a commitment to go back every single year. And so that's where the relationship is going to be. It's going to be up to the African nations to manage it. That's not our responsibility to manage it. And you know, China has its challenges on human rights and all, and you know, what do they call it at the last Communist Party thing? Socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's what the president of
Do
China
a little capacity building as well. They come in and build the projects and do it with their own people.
But we are not there. You know, when you think
No technology.
right, exactly. When you think about this strategic demographics that we just shared with you, that's a problem that we're not doing.
Next question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Carolyn. I am in the evening MBA program here at Georgetown, and I also work at the university during the day, so I goes here all the time. My question is kind of going back to this idea that you touched upon of how Africa is huge and diverse and very vibrant. And so my question is, to what degree is it productive to talk about Africa as kind of a unit, and to what degree does the conversation need to be broken down further into the different regions? And also, if we are talking about Africa as one unit, to what degree does it further generalize to other developing regions of the world?
Okay. Do you want to take part of that?
This is your show.
All right. So I think that's a great question. Yeah, I do believe in signature programs for the continent. I do believe in those. I think that we've had some very good ones. We've got the African Growth and Opportunity Act. We have the Young African Leadership Initiative, Leaders Initiative, which is called YALI, which does not look like it's going to survive with another appropriation after this year. I don't know. We don't know yet.
It's going to survive because we're going to look for other
Means, okay, so that's fine. And I understand that the former President Obama might take that on too. It's one of the things that he does with this new foundation. So I do believe that there are signature, like PEPFAR, you know, the HIV/AIDS initiative, signature things that we can do. That doesn't exclude us doing things country by country as well, because it's not a cookie cutter approach to what's going on in every country. So yes, but I do think they need to fall under a thematic framework, which we've always done. You know, we have the democracy, human rights, and governance framework. We've got the business trade, and we've got the security framework. And you could, you know, include, you know, health and education, the social sector. I think those frameworks still have to be there. Because as I said earlier, they're not disconnected in my view. I don't see how you can disconnect them from each other. And similarly, I think that, when we look at our relationship with other developing regions of the world, whether it's Latin America or Asia or Southeast Asia, I think we have to have the same kind of frameworks. We can have broad regional programs. There's nothing wrong with that. We can have broad thematic things to focus on. But I think certainly there is an individualization aspect to that when you look at it country by country. Because you have some countries like Ghana, which in a lot of our views is a model democracy in terms of the length of time it's had a peaceful transition from one government to another. So will we be looking at the same kind of challenges with election monitoring and election commissions and all of that in Ghana that we might be looking in, Kenya and other places? Probably not. But it still would fall under the broad umbrella of democracy, governance, and transparency. I think that's how I would put it. That's how I would put it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure. How do you see the socioeconomic foundation for a model that may discriminate in terms of how we approach Africa as a continent, in terms of North Africa and the general rest of Africa? I'm an Egyptian national, and I work with many literacy institutes and non-profits that have this aching problem of many Africa pan-national organizations that either the United Nations or the USAID runs that generally doesn't focus on the regions of North Africa and rather stations it in a more Middle East perspective. So how do you see the conflation configuration between those two things?
I think we've had a historical discussion about that, at least in the State Department, for as long as I have been in the State Department, whether or not there should be one Africa Bureau, whether or not it should be, which it still is, North Africa as is included in the Middle East Bureau, and then you have the Africa Bureau focused on Sub-Saharan Africa. In other agencies, I'm not sure how DoD breaks down the same.
DoD
Does not break it down the
One
same.
continent.
One continent, and the old USIA was one continent as well.
And the national security staff.
NSC, yeah,
NSC.
NSC is one staff. So I don't know why state has never, we've had these battles in state to do it for years, as long as I have been, and I'm sure as long as you've been in it, for years, to change it to one African Bureau. And it really has to do with appropriations, I would say, more than anything else.
Not cultural devices.
I think to me it's money. To me it's really the
And
appropriation.
even if we made the decision to do it, we've been told Egypt won't be part of it.
Yeah.
And it's the money, it's the relationship with the rest of the Arab world.
Right. And the money, and also how Congress has appropriated the money just for your country over the years. You used to just get a check with
$1
billion dollars is we just get dropped off. Not really dropped off, but that's basically what it was like. And then since, of course, the change with the Mohammed Morsi and others, that's changed a little bit. But definitely at that time, before, Egypt didn't want it either, to be honest.
Egypt kind of played both sides of the road. They were African when it was convenient.
Yeah.
And when it was convenient.
And that's exactly.
I saw a hand back here that I kept.
I remember reading a while ago about an initiative that started in Nigeria where there were $58 million and they would advertise it on the radio, saying that any small business that wanted money or needed money could just get it for free. And apparently that went on and it was pretty successful. I don't know if you're
In Nigeria, you're saying?
Yeah.
No.
I don't know.
It would have been 58 million naira anyway, it wouldn't have been dollars.
Yeah.
And which is the local currency. There is a small business initiative under the central bank,
Right.
and that started about 2.5 years ago. I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, it was a while ago.
About 2.5 years ago, and it wasn't sort of anybody that wants it can get it. It was actually managed by the Bank of Industry, which is, we don't really have anything similar to that kind of, but Bank of Industry is a parastatal of the government falling under the Ministry of Trade. And so central bank wanted to help small businesses or SMEs, and so they provided a fund, but the fund had to be managed by an entity. and that entity was the Bank of Industry, which is the government parastatal under the Ministry of Trade. That is still going on. But I just spoke to a group of Nigerian SMEs on the panel with the president of the Bank of Industry in November, where you had SMEs really complaining about that, but the ability to get money from the fund. But I think their perception is a little bit skewed because it's still a bank, and you still have to meet the qualifications of a bank. It's not a grant. If you want a grant, look for a grant issuing entity. If you want a bank loan, you got to meet the requirements of a bank loan. And if you're not there to do that, there are so many programs out there to help you get there. There are lots of programs at NGOs and foundations that do SME training and teach you how to manage your resources and all that. So if you're applying to a bank, you're applying to a bank. It is not a grant. So the complaints you may hear about that is that issue, where people didn't understand that this was not a grant. It wasn't free money, it was a loan, and it was 58 million naira.
So I hand back here to you. I had you once. Yes,
Yeah. So I just wanted to say something about what he said. I mean, even in academia, we Middle East is always placed with North Africa, and I really don't know what that has to do. I guess it has to do with the historical relations and how North Africa was being studied. They had more connections with the Middle East than they had with the rest of Africa and with the rest of Europeans. So in a way, it shifted them into that kind of categorization. So we don't. Sometimes some Africans forget that North Africa is part of Africa, but it is. And then I also wanted to make I don't know, you said something about IT and women, and I wanted to point out something in the Ghanaian case, our Ghanaian students studying here. In the past 5 years, there's been some bit of development of women in IT, which is.
You have a great example that I do mention in here, the hubs that are coming up just for women to teach women IT. One of the great examples is actually in Ghana, and there is an NGO that has started an after-school program just for young girls ages 12 and 13.
There's a similar one in Nigeria.
And there's a similar one in Nigeria,
for
exactly. And there's the Africa Hub for Women. So all of these hubs are cropping up. But when you look at the need versus what's being done, the gap is still there. But Ghana has a lot of great examples. Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa have a lot of great examples. But the need is still greater for women, and particularly for young girls.
Yes.
Okay, so good evening. Thank you for your presentation. And my question is related to the high level of corruption that there are in Africa. Unfortunately, bribes are quite common in most of the countries in Africa. Many people refer to this bribe as the cost of doing business. So I would like you to ask, first of all, which role are the local regulators playing, trying to avoid these corruption issues? And the second one is, how this corruption affect the competitive landscape for the small and medium enterprises?
Yeah, corruption is. Can you tell me your name?
Ramiro.
Ramiro. Okay, gracias. Corruption is still a big issue, on the continent. And I think for SMEs, it can be even a greater challenge. But what I would add to that, though, if you do see a number of countries really putting the brakes on corruption and really pushing back and trying to bring back stolen assets and resources, Nigeria is definitely in the forefront of trying to do that. Corruption and transparency issues. I think I talked about that earlier, how SMEs on the continent are also using their political voice, and corruption and transparency, and having legislative laws and implementation that address those issues are something that a lot of SMEs are adding their political voice to when they're looking at the candidates they're voting. I don't think that I've heard an election in the last, several years that doesn't have anti-corruption and transparency as part, even if they don't really mean it, it's still being said. So it definitely is a challenge. It is a challenge for SMEs, but they're adding their voice to pushing back on that. But just like anywhere else, it hasn't stopped SMEs from still finding a way to do business and be successful. So the challenges are there. There's absolutely no question about that. They're just like we have them here in the U.S. I mean, we're not immune to the challenges of corruption and influence peddling and all of that either. But it doesn't bring us to a dead stop. And for many of the African countries, it doesn't bring them to a dead stop either. It has made it more challenging in some countries where it's rampant, but it doesn't mean that you still can't find a way to do business properly. Competitive advantage, I think that the anti-corruption effort and the focus on anti-corruption has been so strong over the last 6 years or so. You know, countries do pay attention to where they are on the Transparency International Index. They do. It's embarrassing. And so it has factored into things in a positive way, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot more that needs to be done.
There's been a lot of grassroots.
Renee, please.
Mike.
Mike.
There's been a lot of grassroots opposition to acceptance of the U.S.
I can't really hear you, sorry.
There's been a lot of grassroots opposition in recent years toward acceptance of the U.S. Industrialized agricultural model. What's the status of that?
I am not for the U.S. industrial agricultural model being done on the continent. I don't know. I've worked with a lot of small farm holders on the continent, and I do think some assistance in modernization. I think some assistance in drought-resistant seeds. I work with one entity called Songhai, which I'm on their board, and we've started 3 Songhais in Nigeria. But and they focus on small farm holders thinking about being farmer entrepreneurs. And to me, that takes away the large industrial farm model. And I don't think, given the fact that you have the number of small farm holders that you have on the continent, I don't think it's a practical response to the food security and the regional sectoral issues that Africa or some African countries had for food security. Because what you have when you do that is you displace the small farm holder. So you add to the lack of employment or jobs, or whatever you want to call it. And you add more complications because then you're focused on getting in spare parts for big mechanized machines. A lot of times the big mechanized machines that come from the US don't survive because they can't survive the climate. They're not made for the climate. So with the dust and the heat and all of that, they don't survive. The amount of rainfall in some countries, which is really like a downpouring, it could be a flood, an immediate flash flood, and it just wipes out everything. Our big equipment can't move. So for all of those reasons, plus I don't think it helps with the food security issue when you do that. I think supporting small farm holders, where the bulk of the farmers are for the continent, and making them or helping them become more efficient, helping them trade more, helping them move food from rural areas to urban areas or doing more urban farming, I think is the way to go. And you see more urban farms like Songhai cropping up in places like Lagos and in Cape Town and Johannesburg. So I'm not the big mechanized farm supporter at all, but I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think there's room for both because of the food needs, and I think there are possibilities for exports that don't happen because we're not taking advantage of all of the land availability on the continent of Africa that could be used for larger farms. I've seen some of the larger farms in Ethiopia, and they are working quite well. But I certainly agree with you that we also have to support the small